mining for meaning, doing family history research. We are really delighted to have two excellent speakers for you here today. So we'll hear the papers from each of them, and then we'll have a Q&A after that. If you want to chat with each other or comment on the papers while they're going on, do feel free to use the chat for that, but also use the chat function for any questions that you may pop up that you would like to have asked in the Q&A section. What our plan is that people will put their questions in the chat, and I will read them out in the Q&A session, just because there are so many of us here. If we try to manage it a different way, it can get a little tangled. With that in mind, please, you've all been muted by our lovely tech support. Please keep yourself on mute, because it avoids feedback and allows the speakers to speak with some clarity. Also, when you're thinking about questions, of course, remember to be respectful. We may disagree with each other on points, but we should always be respectful on how we do that disagreement. So those are the kind of, the only other thing I would want to remind you all is that this session is being recorded. It'll be up in about 2 weeks' time. So just bear that in mind. And also, I would recommend that you use the speaker view function while speakers are speaking, rather than the gallery view. It just gives a better experience. Okay, so our first speaker then today is Stuart Rosenblatt, and he will be speaking with the title, "If We Knew What We Were Doing, We Would Not Call It Research." And Stuart heads the Irish Genealogical Society, which is a division of the Irish Jewish Museum in Dublin. He's written 21 volumes, my goodness, on Irish Jewry, covering 32 counties over 300 years. He's also a Peace Commissioner and a Fellow of the Genealogical Society of Ireland for his indefatigable work on Irish Jewry and their current president. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Stuart. Stuart, if you would unmute yourself, and if you have slides that I believe you can share them. Is that correct, Zoe?
No, I'm not technically.
Oh, you're speaking, so just for speaking. Okay, so we'll all go to speaker view and we'll have later a lovely view of your face.
Thank you. And the plates behind me. At least they won't be chucked at me. Borada and Cade Midafulcha. On behalf of the Irish Jewish Genealogical Society, I welcome you to this session. If we knew what we were doing, we would not call it research. And that was a quote attributed to Albert Einstein. And who am I to prove this man wrong? I guess it is all relative. As we say in Ireland, if you're going there, you would not start from here. Today's deliberation will cover the early history of the Irish Jewish Genealogical Society, the Welsh connection to Ireland, Irish mythology, Irish cemeteries, as well as the Limerick programme, the Cork and Belfast communities, Gibraltar refugees, alien registration, and Ada Shulman's birth journal. Not necessarily in that order, and possibly a little bit more. The entertainer George Burns once said, "A good talk should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the beginning and end should be very close together." Interestingly, I do have a connection to Abertawe in Swansea, going back 55 years, where for 18 months lived in Swansea uplands in Sketty, I should say. And I take this opportunity to thank the Swansea Jewish community for welcoming me. It was a memorable and maturing time, especially Saturday nights going to Mumble's Pier. One particular person that I remember is Kate Kalinsky, who was an elocution mistress and a wonderful person with a great personality, well known and respected by all who had the privilege of meeting her. She married Isaac Barnett Snipper, and their Swansea-born son Morris married Mona White in Dublin, and I knew this family. There was great interaction between the Welsh Jewish community and the Irish Jewish community, both north and south, including Swansea, Cardiff, Newport, Dyfed, Aberdare, Aled, Aberfan, Pontypridd, Pontyminster, and they are some of the places where people settled in Wales, becoming very proud of their Welsh heritage. All these towns have a connection to Ireland. There is one marriage that took place in Llangollen. I have no idea where Llangollen is in Wales, and I ask you to help me out. Not to mention Mountain Ash in Glamorgan, where Anne Telchin was born in 1868, just a little bit before my time. All these towns and people have an association to Ireland. To put into perspective what has been achieved single-handedly over the last 25 years, started as a personal family quest. It evolved into a 32-county search for every Jewish person who graced the fair shores of Ireland, spanning 300 years, with some records from the 1500s. At its height in the 1950s, Irish Jewry never had more than 5,500 individuals living in the Republic and Northern Ireland. The Irish Jewish Genealogical Society was formed in 1999 as a division of the Irish Jewish Museum, which now houses 21 volumes personally printed, appertaining to the community, including ascendants and descendants with many branch family details. There are 5 copies of this opus freely available for research, not only in the Jewish Museum in Dublin, but also in Ireland's National Library, the National Archives, the Genealogical Society of Ireland, the Dublin City Library, where the Lord Mayor of Dublin accepted volumes on behalf of the city, and of course, my personal copy. At the last count, which was 2 days ago, there were 67,930 individual records. The Idiot's Guide to Irish Jewish Ancestry is the only published book. There were 200 copies printed, and I need to sell 300 to break even. And that, can you see that? Is it back to front or upside down? I don't know. That's my book. The Jewish presence in Ireland is not a recent phenomenon. Over 1,000 years ago, according to Irish mythology, a Hebrew princess came from the east, bringing her with her the harp, which some of you know from the Guinness brand, has become Ireland's national symbol. For me, if the harp comes on an envelope, it is not the Guinness I'm thinking of. It is our arch enemy, the income tax people, also referred to as the revenue commissioners. As this mythological story goes, the Hebrew princess also brought with her the stone of destiny, the same stone that served as a pillow on which our biblical forefather Jacob rested his head on the night he wrestled with the angel. Irish tribes that were conquered by Scotland brought the stone back with them. It became known as the Stone of Scone, and on it Scottish kings and later kings and queens of England were crowned ever since. The first recorded appearance of Hebrews in Ireland is in the Allans of Inishfollen, a chronicle of medieval Irish history, which says curtly, year 1079, 5 Jews came to Ireland from over the sea, bringing them with gifts from Toteldach, and then were sent back over the sea. Toteldach was king of Munster and the high king of Ireland, and the grandson of Brian Boru. It is probable they came as merchants from Rouen, situated on the River Seine in France, where there was a well-established trading center at the time. Later, following the expulsion of Jews from Portugal in 1496, some Hebrews made their way to the south coast of Ireland in the town of Youghal in County Cork. The first Lord Mayor of Ireland was William Ennis, and he was elected in 1555. In latter years, Robert Briscoe was elected Lord Mayor of Dublin in 1956 and 61, and his son Brian Briscoe in 1988. And there were, of course, Gerald Goldberg was Lord Mayor of Cork in 1977. In Europe and in England, Jews were encouraged to engage in money lending, an activity forbidden to Christians. They helped finance many English wars. Through an egg on his debts in 1249, King Henry III expelled the Jews of Britain to Ireland and confiscated the wealth on the pretext of failing to pay a special Jew tax. 40 years later, in 1290, King Edward I expelled the Jews from the domains of the English crown, again so not to have to repay his debts on the pretext they refused to take up the occupation of farming. Oliver Cromwell encouraged the Jewish people in 1656 to resettle in the British Isles after 400 years of exile because he considered their supposed wealth and reputation for industry was likely to advance the commercial interests of the country. These early settlers called themselves foreign Protestants. In 1660, they established a synagogue in Dublin consisting of a prayer room in 5 Crane Lane opposite Dublin Castle off Dame Street, which was then the main street of Dublin, in one of the merchant family homes. A cemetery was purchased in Ballybough with a property document in August 1748, and this graveyard was originally used from 1718, with the last burial in 1910. Commonly known in those early years as a Jew's field, Ballybough got its name from Ballybuch, village of the poor. This is where the new arrivals landed before traveling to Dublin a mile away. The first interment was for a Moses J. Cowan in 1748, and he was age 65, and he was a traveling dwarf from Poland. Interestingly, which I didn't know at the time, there were 7 Jewish burial grounds in Ireland, with 5,750 interments, with over 10,000 more who died abroad. There are 30,000 births, 17,500 marriages, and Irish marriages are fully documented from 1845. Limerick Jewry was an interesting and a colourful past. For like most provisional communities in Ireland, it no longer exists. After arrival in Limerick, the Jewish emigrants were victims of assaults from some sections of the native population. However, at times there was also arguments on assaults amongst themselves, and a common location for many of these quarrels seems to have been the synagogue. On one occasion, while celebrating the Sabbath, the rabbi was knocked down and the book being used for the service was taken away. One member of the community was injured. It was reported to the police, but no one in the community turned up at the police station to give a statement as to what had happened. Limerick was also known for the 1904 boycott instigated by the Redemptionist priest Father John Craig. Although sometimes referred to as the Limerick pogrom, no one died, but the economic boycott drove most of the Israelites out of the city. Father Craig accused the Jews of coming to Limerick to fasten themselves on us like leeches and to draw our blood. He accused them of engaging in dubious business methods and said, they also shed Christian blood and would kidnap and slay Christian children if they could. He encouraged an economic boycott, and as flock reneged on their lawful debts, many Jewish families became so impoverished that they had to be helped by the London charities. Virtually all of the 170 strong Jewish community in Limerick were from the village of Akmeny in Lithuania, where my mother's family comes from. Traveling to Limerick, to the Civil Trust, to combine my research with the community, the much larger community of the Cork Jewish community, the curator presented me with a huge volume of files. And this enabled the presentation of a special volume, which included births, marriages, deaths, census, school enrollments, and other details of Limerick, including the intrigues of everyday life. After the Limerick boycott, many families left for Dublin and Cork in England, where the details were discovered and are now recorded for posterity. School enrollment books are an underused area of family research. They give the date of entry, age of the student, address and the father's name and with occupation, details about the pupil, if coming from another school, leaving for another school, getting married or emigrating, leads to further research. There are over 10,000 individual school records on file. My best experience was in the Belfast Royal Academy, otherwise known as the BRA, where a prefect was assigned to me. This was in contrast to the week previous in a Dublin school. While extracting details from the enrollment ledger, I was asked to leave the room while the teachers had a cup of tea. Normally they asked me to join them, but this time they didn't. Taking myself into the corridor like a naughty child, found a storage room, sat on a ladder, and continued my work. The Belfast Jewish community allowed access to their cemeteries records, enabling the recording of thousands of tombstone inscriptions, including the memorial plaques, also the synagogue marriage register, combined with the 1901 and 1911 census and school enrollments. This was the first time that the community of Belfast had been comprehensively recorded, and I might mention of Northern Ireland too. There are two Jewish cemeteries in Belfast. The main one is in Clonmany, and the original cemetery in Belfast city centre, where one of the most intriguing and unusual documents were found. The order of burial requiring the ground to be opened for a burial in the Jewish ground, Belfast, 1873. And it gives the date, cause of death, section and number, with the time of the funeral, the person's name and age and occupation, residential address, with the fee of 10 shillings paid. It's a pity they didn't continue doing the 10 shillings now. There was a Jewish community in Londonderry, Banbridge, and Newry, Lurgan, as well as 30 plus kinder transport children who found safety from Nazi Germany from 1938 to 48 in Malile Farm, which is 20 miles from Belfast. The welcome by the Jewish community of Belfast allowed these traumatized children to mature into responsible adults. The Malile National School enrollment records list the children not only from the farm, but also Jewish children evacuated from Belfast to avoid the bombings. Also during World War II, refugees from Gibraltar were housed in Saintfield, County Down. And that, I have to say, was a very interesting discovery. Not only, with only a name, I phoned directory inquiries. That's the best place to find information in Gibraltar. Luckily for me, the first person contacted was evacuated as a child from Saintfield and received a delightful amount of family details on the residents of the internment camp. There are over 6,247 entries for Northern Ireland, with copies of this discovery in the safe hands of Prony, the Linen Hall Library, the Belfast Jewish Community, and the Northern Ireland Historical Society, where the Mayor of Newtownards accepted a copy on their behalf. And we mustn't miss out on Cork. The late Freddie Rosehill generously helped me gather so much detail. My enthusiasm to travel from Dublin to Cork went to the wrong train station at 7 a.m. in the morning. Luckily, when eventually arriving at the right station, the train had been delayed. I remember that situation very clearly because I jumped over the railing and shouted to the guard who was just going to blow the whistle and raise the green flag. Hold the train, hold the train. Normally say hold the front page. This was hold the train. And I opened the door, jumped in, through my, then I said to myself, well, what am I going to do here? I have no ticket. Well, that's another story. Somebody wants to ask about it. After arriving in Cork, Freddie took me to the cemetery overlooking the River Lee, and what a beautiful resting place. There were tombstones in memory of the Jewish passengers drowned after the Germans torpedoed the Lusitania on the 7th of May, 1915. 100 years later, I was privileged to represent the Cork Jewish community at the memorial service in Kinsale. Freddie also showed me extracts from the original marriage registers with the signatures of the participants and witnesses with address and occupation. The burial register also allowed the finding of burials that were no longer there, or tombstones hadn't been erected. Many of the families were poor or left the country. For Cork, there are 334 interments, 295 marriages, and 837 births. It should be mentioned that there was an earlier graveyard in Kemp Street in Cork dating back to the 17th century, when Jewish traders were encouraged to live from this undocumented period. The Lord Mayor of Cork accepted a copy on the Cork Jewish community's behalf, and of course Freddie Roosevelt has a copy. Unfortunately, he died in November 2016 and was literally the last man standing of the Cork community. I might mention that there are 14 different areas where death details were found. Probably the most unusual place for research was the time I went to the appointed funeral directors of the Dublin Jewish community. Regrettably, they had no details that I had not already recorded. Another wonderful find was in Roscommon Archives, 60 miles from Dublin, where the archival material had been sent for storage. They showed me marriage details from 1845 to 1909, the earliest marriages to be performed under license. I went into shock. To phrase it nicely, I was gobsmacked. That was the first time I had ever seen marriages from St. Mary's Abbey Synagogue. They also presented a marriage volume for Dublin Camden Street Synagogue. Never ever heard of a synagogue in Camden Street. This was history of incalculable value. How to extract the details would take a month of Sundays traveling back and forth. Gently asking if it was possible to use the photocopier for the odd record proved no problem. They were going for lunch and left me locked in. And first of all, I'd made sure that there was plenty of A3 paper were loaded in the photocopier. Let us just say, you could have fried an egg on that photocopier, it got so hot. Having achieved what was needed, the marriage records for the whole of Jewish Ireland from 1845 to 2020 are now documented with the original signature of the participants and witnesses, many with their mark X, some in Yiddish, and in one instance, the Hebrew date was added. Some of the other sources of my data are business name changes, calendar of wills, deed poll, voters registers, street directories, community listings, valuation or council tax files. The alien registration file of 1914 to 22 was a magnificent and exciting discovery. And that was found in the National Archives, providing a moment in time when non-nationals, that is non-British subjects, had to register with the police, and if traveling 8 miles from home, they had to register in the next jurisdiction. The recorded town of birth was a bonus. The Genealogical Society of Ireland has digitized a privately held alien registration volume, which may be accessed through their website. The demonstration of how to search a name and then see the individual details as they originally entered into this register is a credit to them. Finally, the research and discovery of probably one of the most unique, unusual, private and personal accounts of births attended from the 7th of April, 1896 to April 1908 has been preserved. This ledger records the births of 264 deliveries out of 1,380 plus that the Jewish midwife Ada Shulman attended to over the years. There was a penalty for late registrations. According to the 1863 Birth Registration Act, a fine of up to 10 or 20 shillings, that's a lot of money those then, was incurred for the late and non-registration of births and deaths. This fine was increased to 40 shillings in 1880. For Ada, times were hard, and traveling into and back from to the Dublin city entailed the expense of buying a ticket for the return tram journey. Ada Shulman listed the birth dates in the GRO, General Registration Office, according to when it was convenient, hence multiple entries in the page. Even her ledger was not entirely accurate, and that is why some of the children born in 1890s to 1920 will discover that their actual dates of birth did not necessarily coincide with the date recorded in the birth certificate. The question often asked is what will happen to this Rosenblatt library? And that is a question which needs addressing now. What would you suggest, or who would you suggest would be a worthy repository or institution to house this record of the wonderful Irish Jewish community? This is the only one of its kind in the world, a collector of research data that captures the entire archival collection of an ethnic minority community in Ireland. It is also unique in the Jewish world, and it is a single source of study for the whole Jewish community within a European country or the world. If you know anyone with an Irish Jewish connection, marrying in or marrying out is no consequence to me, please feel free to give out my phone number and email address and website, irishjewishroots.com. Sharing is the name of the game. Albert Einstein was definitely right. If we knew what we were doing, we would not call it research. Diolch an fawr. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I hope everyone will join me in thanking Stuart for that really fascinating talk. When we began with such excellent early information, I couldn't see how you'd get through the whole of it in 20 minutes, that you stuck to time wonderfully and gave us all sorts of things to think about. We'll hold questions until both speakers have spoken, and we'll have a combined Q&A session. But I wanted to thank Stuart there. Now, we'll move now on to Ruth Badley. And Ruth is going to be speaking to us about the process of turning your family history into a book. Ruth is an author and a freelance writer with a background in journalism and arts education. Her first book, Where Are the Grown-Ups?, is an award-winning family memoir exploring the impact of a whispered tragedy on 3 generations of her family. She gives talks to family history research organizations, book clubs, festivals, writers, and worldwide. Her work has been featured in the Jewish Chronicle, special interest magazines, and on BBC Radio. So welcome, Ruth. And I see you have your slides up already, and I hope you're unmuted as well. I can't see you. So thanks, Ruth. We'll see you now.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Okay. My talk today is going to focus on how I went about turning an aspect of my own family history into a book, and how I approached 3 of the principal challenges. And for me, these challenges were, how can I use research to identify the story I want to tell? How can I bring the people on my family tree to life as characters on the page? And how do I keep readers turning the pages? Where Are the Grown-Ups explores the impact of a hidden tragedy on 3 generations of my mother's family. It was a project that began shortly after my mother's death in 2015. But when I began writing, I didn't know if I had a story that would make a complete book. My writing started as a response to grief, and I found writing was a helpful way to process my feelings. I started to think about the small amount of knowledge I had around my mother's birth and childhood, because I felt this had affected her emotional well-being as an adult and rippled across the relationship she had with me. I knew my mother had been adopted as a tiny baby by a childless aunt and uncle because her birth mother had died. Her father swiftly remarried, and his second wife did her best to cut my mother out of his life. Something fundamental was missing in my mother's childhood, and this had affected her deeply. And the impact of all this sadness and the gap in our family history was never examined in my mother's lifetime. I started writing down some memories of my own childhood in an attempt to understand what had gone wrong between us. And eventually this became the first part of my book, which is a first-person account of what I was observing about the adult world in general and my Jewish family in particular. From about the age of 7 to 16, during the 1960s and 70s, I was observing the slow breakdown of my parents' marriage, and I very quickly made up my mind that my mother was to blame. I was writing about a historical period, but one I had lived through. So to help me get my thoughts down on paper, I had to access buried memories and recreate a credible historical backdrop. It was very helpful and also very enjoyable to look back at popular music, household brand names, and significant news events of my childhood. Most importantly, for me, was recalling the geography of my childhood home. The rooms, the objects, and the layout helped me to remember the emotions connected to significant events and to put myself back into those moments. I'd made a start on the writing when something extraordinary happened that changed the game entirely. I was in the process of sorting out my mother's possessions when I came across family photographs, and in particular, photos of the missing grandmother, mother and grandmother that no one had ever spoken about. And if Zoe could put my second slide up, I can share what I found with you. Thank you. So I happened upon these two photographs, and I think you'll agree they are wow photographs. The person on the left, Rose Wagenhusen, is my missing grandmother. Her family were from the Dutch community that settled in the East End of London at the beginning of the 20th century. She married Ruben de Haan, also from the Dutch community, and here they are on their wedding day. Their story is part of my story, and I really wanted to know more. And obtaining copies of their marriage and death certificates provided answers to many of the questions I had. And it was only when I obtained copies of these documents that I realized I had a story that I wanted to tell. And if I told it well, it was one that might interest other people. The documents revealed details that my mother was never told concerning my maternal grandmother's short life and early death, and gave me a route into my grandparents' lives in the East End of London, their occupations, their ages, addresses, dates, places of death, and importantly, the medical condition that caused my grandmother's death at the age of 25, 3 days after giving birth to my mother. The facts in the documents effectively brought the people in the photographs out of the shadows. I learned by looking at the documents that my grandparents had less than 10 months of happiness as husband and wife before Rose died of postpartum eclampsia, a rare but very specific complication following childbirth. The humanity and tragedy of my ancestors' lives was really revealed to me for the first time through these documents, and that's what inspired me to want to communicate the story to a wider group of readers beyond my immediate family. The documents also gave me an indication of the additional research I needed to do to be able to reconstruct my grandparents as credible characters, using the novel writer's techniques of scenes and dialogue to tell their story. My aim was to go beyond the stark facts and help readers identify with some of the complex emotions thrown up by their situation and the repercussions of it. The official documents told me that my grandmother was a cigarette maker, and at the time of his marriage, my grandfather was said to be a racecourse tipster. From other sources, I already knew that my grandfather was also a rogue and a would-be gangster. So I had quite a lot of research to do on racecourses, petty crime, cigarette production and childbirth in the Jewish East End in 1930. I consulted hospital patient records, maps of the area where my ancestors lived and died. I'm not a genealogist or a historian, so I corresponded with academics and hospital archivists, libraries, medical experts, synagogue administrators and midwives, and I took a one-to-one walking tour in the East End with an eminent guide. One of the best things I did was to live in the same area as my ancestors. For 6 months, I lived a short walk from where many of the events in the book took place. It was very powerful and meaningful to be able to walk in my relatives' footsteps to places like Sandys Row Synagogue, Marlow Road Cemetery, and many of the locations and addresses associated with my family history. I also spent time at Tower Hamlets Local History and Archive, looking at newspapers and photographs in their collection. I read as many true accounts of life in the East End as I could, but I reached a point when the research was actually preventing me from writing the story I wanted to tell. I had too much historical information, and it was leading me in too many directions. I had details of my ancestors going back to the 1880s in Amsterdam, but it became clear to me that my story needed to focus on specific people covering 3 generations, and I had to stick to that, or the story I wanted to tell would be diluted. I think there's also a danger that historical research becomes the story in itself. It has to serve the story. Otherwise, the author is just saying, look at me and how much research I've done. And it becomes very dull to read. So I try to only include details of time and place that push the story forward, and I use those with a light touch. When research didn't give me a definitive answer, I relied on a combination of knowledge and instinct to fill the gaps. For example, when I researched cigarette production, I learned that in the late 1920s, mechanization was just being brought into cigarette factories. I thought about this and I concluded that new technology doesn't arrive everywhere at the same time. So I decided to make Rose, my grandmother, a hand roller. A historian told me that aside from bigger companies like Godfrey Phillips, there were smaller enterprises in the East End manufacturing bespoke cigarettes. So that was where I placed Rose in my story. This was the kind of factory where artisan hand-rolling skills were in danger of disappearing. Her marriage certificate said her father was a cigar maker, originally from Holland, and it was conceivable to me that his daughter might also be employed in the artisan tobacco industry. Another challenge when writing about a period outside your direct experience is that you can't possibly know who said what to whom, because you weren't actually there. What I was aiming to do in the writing was to get to the emotional truth of situations, and I can give you an example of what I mean. My mother was once told that after Rose died, all the family met to decide what was to be done about the baby. Her father arrived at the tiny house in Stepney Green in East London that many of them shared, and he was holding his tiny newborn daughter in his arms and laid her down on an old battered sofa while the adults decided on a solution. This is how it was explained to her. When I came to write that scene, I had to think about where her father had come from, and I decided that he'd come straight from the hospital with Rose's death certificate in his pocket. In my book, he walks home from the hospital in Whitechapel through the streets of Stepney Green. The route he takes is possible, but in reality, it couldn't have happened that way because the actual hospital where Rose died was too far away to walk. I don't think it's important that I deviated from the exact facts. I had him walk home in order to convey the terrible sadness and helplessness of his situation, because he encounters members of his community on the way, and he has to deal with their visible grief, and in one case, a lack of awareness over what has happened. Looking at the photograph of my grandfather on his wedding day, it's hard to believe that he was only 24 years old when he became a father and a widower in the same week. I have 2 adult sons, so it was easy for me to imagine a young man of this tender age having to deal with such a dreadful responsibility. This was uppermost in my mind and really helped me to get inside his head. I should add that he was a deeply flawed character, largely because of his own upbringing, which I also explain in the book. So I knew my mother's backstory would be the crux of the tale. But instinctively, I didn't want to start at the beginning and tell it all in chronological order, because I felt this would be a much less interesting reader experience. A family tree, as we all know, is a series of straight lines, but I wanted to make the story much more intriguing. I wanted readers to wonder what had happened in the past to make my mother the way she was, and to want to know more about her and her childhood experiences. I was aiming to create some drama and suspense, so I structured the book in 3 parts to let the story unfold gradually through a combination of my authentic lived experience and Jewish social history. Inheritance is a theme running through the book because when I started putting the story together, I found a recurring pattern of human behavior rippling through the generations. And it made me think about what we inherit from our ancestors: our looks, the material things that have meaning for us, skills, talents, but maybe also weaknesses, flaws, bad luck, and mistakes. Where Are the Grown-Ups has a cast of characters that often unwittingly repeat the mistakes of the past. And these include some very assertive and controlling women, a succession of weak men, a couple of heroic husbands, and 2 monstrous stepmothers. As we all have challenging family relationships from time to time, I hope that some of the very personal situations I described would resonate with others and perhaps remind them of something similar in their own families. Readers have told me that what they like about my story is that I don't sugarcoat the relationships. So in that spirit, I would like to hold my hands up here and say that I showed scant interest in my mother's childhood while she was alive. I didn't ask the important questions that I should have asked as a daughter. And in writing this book, I've attempted to make amends for that. It's never too late to say sorry has been my motto in the writing. In conclusion, there is another very important aspect to writing about family history that I would like to end on, that is appropriate to the concept of connecting small histories. My grandmother's story is a small history of a very ordinary life. Rose didn't change the world or achieve anything remarkable in her short life, but her absence had a profound effect on the daughter and granddaughter she didn't know. And writing her story has helped me make peace with the past and given her a longer life through my book than she was allowed on earth. It's also put me in touch with several relatives I didn't know I had, including a cousin, now in his 90s. At Sandys Rose Synagogue in Spitalfields, as part of a heritage project, there is now a permanent plaque in memory of Rose and her sister Esther, where they were both married. And I'm very grateful to the Connecting Small Histories project for the opportunity to share my family's story with you today. If Zoe can show the final slide. Thank you. Thanks everybody for listening, and I hope my talk has given you some insight into how to approach and share aspects of family history with a wider audience. On the screen is information about where to obtain a copy of Where Are the Grown-Ups if you're interested in knowing more. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That was a really, really fascinating and excellent talk. And again, I hope everyone will join me in thanking Ruth for that. Now, it's great to have a balance of two different papers like this, because Stuart's opened us up with the kind of nitty gritty of doing historical research in terms of getting the information into an archive and getting those facts in place. And then Ruth has carried on telling us what we can do when we find those facts and how we can turn those into stories that really matter to people. So I'm looking forward to some really good questions for both of our speakers. I have, what I'm going to suggest is that we start with Stuart, both because that's where we started and also because it will give people a little while to think of some more questions for Ruth. I have one question already for Stuart. If you have more that you were sort of holding back, pop them in the chat, and I have some questions of my own. But let's start with a question for Stuart from Tony, and she asks, were many synagogue minute books available to find out more information about the Irish communities? In last night's session, one researcher said that minute books from the English communities were often hard to come by.
Unmute. So I'm unmuted now?
No, you're grand, yeah.
Okay. One of the aspects of the Jewish psyche is not to have records. They're dismal and disgraceful. And that unfortunately goes for many of the minute books of synagogues that are well past. I did come across the Cork minutes of their meetings, which make very fascinating reading. And overall, the answer is no. The community keeps no records of circumcisions. There's very few records, only of call-up books of Hebrew names. Ladies, girls' names are not recorded anywhere. And I find this disgraceful situation because ultimately a lot of people die and they may be single. There's no marriage ketubah with their Hebrew name that was written on it. And it's just one of those things in the Jewish psyche. And whatever records they do keep, especially in Dublin, are disgraceful. So now they have it all archived. I hope that answers part of your question.
Thank you very much. We also have a question now from Caroline. She asks, Bristol's Jewish community, which she's researching for a PhD, also had links to Ireland. And would you be able to help her if she emails you to explore those links a bit more?
Absolutely. It's so by all coincidences, yesterday I was looking at the burials of people who died in Bristol, and I couldn't find yes, they give you the burial grounds, but they don't have a list of people who are buried there. There's no way of accessing it. So it's a two-way affair, and I certainly will help her out. No problem. And that goes for everybody else as well. Please make contact.
That's great. We also have from Vanessa, we have, Vanessa says that her mother's family were the Green Tucks. Oh goodness, I will do a bad job of pronouncing Shereshevsky from Lithuania to Dublin, maybe yes. Cork and Belfast, and she'd be interested in the information. She doesn't think she has any remaining family in Ireland, but so that's in the chat, and you can have a look at that as well.
They're all documented.
Yeah, that's excellent to hear. That's really, really good to hear. Can I also ask you some questions, Stuart? For instance, one of the things I'm interested in is, it's great hearing people looking after their own ancestors, but do other people come to you for information using this archive? Or is it really very much people looking after their own ancestors?
Well, I receive a lot of requests for information on people. I do try to ask them to send me their family tree, the old expression goes, eaten bread is soon forgotten. And unless I get the information in, I can't improve the details that they have. And occasionally, or quite often, because of the detail they have, I can do further research on the missing details that they have given me. So it is a two-way affair. At the moment, there's a number of inquiries coming to me for people looking for the original birth certificates so they can get an EU passport. And that's a common theme at the moment. But this goes for everybody, anybody making contact with me, I need to know who they are, their details, who they are, their children's children, because tomorrow we're all history. And I need the connection going back to the person who they're looking for and all the brothers and sisters and what happened to them as well, because they all have that connection to the old sod, as we would call it. And that's my role as I see it. I've taken it upon myself. I do it singularly, much to the contention of my family. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, these volumes are produced for posterity, and hopefully they will be the only record in 100, 200 years' time that will be available somewhere. There's only 5 copies, and mine. Right.
Okay, well, thank you. I hope maybe it's something we can come back to at the end with people thinking about what might be possible to do with that archive and what kinds of ideas they might be having. It's something to keep in mind. Someone's just put in the chat that maybe it should be in the National Library of Israel or the Hebrew University. We maybe have a chat about that separately as well. But let's move on to questions for Ruth, and I'm going to go to kick off with questions for Ruth. Ruth, what would you say is the most interesting part of your historical research?
Well, I think actually it was having access to obstetric patient records from the year 1930 at the archive of Bart's NHS Trust. And this is the same archive that researchers on Call the Midwife use. It was a fascinating experience, but also very emotional. I wanted to understand the kind of treatments and outcomes for women with the same condition as my grandmother. So that's what led me to that archive. And the records I examined showed that in 1930, 11 pregnant women between the ages of 17 and 36 were admitted to the London Hospital Whitechapel with eclampsia. And the condition, if you don't know, plays out in a dangerously raised blood pressure that can lead to fits and organ failure. And it's a condition unique to pregnancy that can still affect women today. 3 women died, and in one heartrending case, both the mother and the baby perished from this condition in 1930, according to the records at this archive. And I thought at the time that there was another book to be written about those 3 women and the events that followed their deaths. And I was quite a naive researcher. As I said, I'm not a historian. I remember asking the archivist, why were some of these entries written in red ink? And he explained that red ink was hospital code for a fatal outcome. So it kind of took my breath away then when I realized what I was looking at and what I was reading. And aside from the medical information, which was invaluable, just looking at the patients' names and their occupations immediately took me back to a different era. So I was looking at women who were milliners and butchers' wives, seamstresses, and their names were Hetty, Dora, Irene, Miriam. Immediately you're back in a different time. So it was immensely interesting and also really, really helpful.
Thank you so much. I don't want to dominate questions for Ruth here. Does anyone have any other questions that they'd like to put to Ruth? Here's a question for you from Suzanne. Yeah. My grandparents came over to UK from Lodz at the turn of the century, at the time of the pogroms. Is there any way I can find out more about their history in their homeland or how they came over? organizations, or maybe someone else might be able to answer the question. She says that, in following a family, what steps did you take to try and get at these more distant connections?
Well, I can answer that, but it might not be very helpful for the lady or whoever it was who was asking about their relatives. I would suggest the Jewish Genealogical Society can help you get on the right track with that. As for my own journey, I had a friend. The time I started thinking about writing this book, a friend of mine had a new hobby, and it was ancestry, and she wanted people that she could work on. And she said, look, can I look at your family tree? And it would be helpful, if I find out anything that you can put in your book. And of course, it was absolutely incredible. I mean, my talk today didn't really go into all the stuff she found out about Rose's family going to Canada and what they did there. So it was very helpful having a friend who was interested and came up with all this research and information that I could use. I had the easy job, really. She did the tough groundwork for me and got me all the documents too. So if you can find a friend that is obsessed with this new hobby, it's immensely helpful. And just going, I'll just add a little bit into that might interest Stuart, because it certainly interested me what he was talking about today. I recently did one of those DNA tests, the saliva test that you send off and they tell you about your ancestry and your DNA. Well, it came back and it was 99% European Jewish. Okay, we know about that. But the 1% is Irish. Apparently, I have DNA matches with several people called O'Connor. I have some work to do there. I haven't had to find out a bit more about that, but it was really intriguing.
That's really great. And that personal connection does lead us to the next question we have for you. Ruthie Lux asks, thanks for talking about the process of making that part fictional story from the body of research, the way that you've described it. How did the living relatives respond to the family story being made public?
Well, do you know what? I was surprised that I have honestly had overwhelmingly and completely 100% positive response. The person I was perhaps a bit concerned about was I have a younger brother, and in the book he's quite a shadowy figure. He's there, but I don't develop him as a character fully, and I don't give him dialogue because I didn't want to put words in his mouth. My experience was my experience and his experience was different. He's 9 years younger than me. And I was concerned about what he might think, but he actually said, you've got it spot on. So I couldn't really have asked for a more satisfying response than that from somebody very close to me. So I can give you an answer that's perhaps slightly more amusing and insightful, in that lots of people ask me, what would your mother think about this book? Because I am quite frank about our relationship, and it was difficult, and I don't really sugarcoat that. And as for my mum, I think I think she would have been very pleased and proud that her story had been highlighted in print. But two things would have infuriated her. And the first would have been the front cover. The front cover, to remind you, it's here. She is on the front cover. That's a little girl. And she would have preferred a much more glamorous shot, because that's the sort of person she was. She was a very glamorous person. And I also reveal a secret that she went to great lengths to conceal, and that was her age. She always took 5 years off her age, and she insisted that she was born in 1935. She actually left a note in her will that stated that her stone was to say she was born in 1935, and my brother and myself, obeyed her wishes. But of course, her own mother's death certificate shows she was born in 1930, and I told the truth in my book.
people might, it's great.
Frozen.
Have we lost the link?
To hear really, oh dear, sorry, I got my internet is unstable. Did I break up there?
You did, yeah. Could you just say that
Yeah,
again?
okay. So I'll start again, which is thank you for bringing up how those specific details, but you know, a date might seem like a dry piece of information to many people. Oh yes, if I just go to the records, I'll only get dates and be really lively. And that brings us back to Stuart and the kinds of information that you've been recording.
No, lost you. You're frozen again. Everybody's frozen.
And detail
You're frozen again.
on it. Again.
Yo, what's happening? Running out of fuel.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. You're frozen.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
I'm so sorry.
The question?
Sometimes the Wi-Fi is just weak on these things.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you could tell us more about how the information you have is recorded. You know, do you have a structure or a program that you use, or, you know, is it just in the books?
Oh, not at all. I have a specially written program called the Carousel program, which I use, and I can put in about 105 different pieces of information on any one individual. I'm looking at three generations at any one time, and I can go from one person to another and see the generations. And I can also bring out generation reports on family with all the individual details printed out.
Wow.
The one thing I do say to people is do not use the online versions of Family Tree, because you can't print the details out. It's great putting it up there for everybody else to see, but you can't print it. And unless you have a hard copy, nothing will survive 100 years. The technology will change, as we've seen ourselves over the years. And so what do you do when there's no copy? You can't give it to any of your children or grandchildren or other members of your family. As for the dates of people which Ruth was talking about, I found this rather amusingly at the 1901 and 1911 census, which have been conducted, the extracts have been taken out of, and you'll find that in, say, 1901, they're aged 30, and in 1911, they're 22. So you can go and figure it out. So that's the way it was. A lot of ladies changed their age for one reason or another. And I think it still goes on today. So I do record it. I can always give you, and then if you wish to, I can give you a demo to show you how it works. Nobody's asked me about Rashida Jones or Quincy Delight Jones. I was involved in Who Do You Think You Are program in the making of part of the journey through Ireland. And I found that very fascinating, because it was 15 people came over with her just to do the photography and recording and so forth. And that brought her back to Lithuania and a connection indirectly to my family. Yeah, indirectly.
So it would be great if you could give us can you give us a demonstration now?
Yes, I can. Am I sharing the screen with you?
Not at the moment. So
Okay.
is that something that needs to be?
I see, that's a different.
Myself
Can I
and
see
Ruth
my
are
screen
pinned.
now? No?
Sorry, 1 minute, I'll do that
I don't
now.
know how you share the
Great,
screen.
thank you.
Share screen. I may have cut myself off too.
Not entirely, it's not giving me an option. Hang on.
Stuart, you should be able to share your screen now if you just give it a go.
Can you see the Irish family carousel coming up?
Have
Do you
you
click share screen?
I can't find out where it is.
clicked the green
Green
button?
button at the bottom.
See.
What sort of device are you on?
That's a good question. Yeah, how do I?
Is it
It's
a Mac,
next to the
is it
word
a Mac
chat.
or a phone?
There's. Right. No share screen. No.
Thank you so much for doing this, because these kinds of little details of technology can be so tricky, can't they?
We can't
It'd be
figure out
lovely
how
to see. It would be lovely to see the program.
You can, if you can't do it, you can send it to me. I'll put my email in the chat and then I can share for you. Oh, there you
Oh
go.
no, here we go.
Oh, what can you see?
Okay, so we've got your screen.
All right, you can see my full screen now.
Yeah, that we
Not
can't
the
see
right
the,
thing.
what we're seeing is your browser. So there's probably a different window with carousel in it, yeah?
Oh yes, this is my front. Can you see the Book of Irish Jewry?
No,
You can't.
unfortunately. What we're seeing is your browser that you're looking at Zoom through. So if you stop share and reshare, that you should get a grid of choices.
I'm stop sharing. Now I'm back.
And then hit it again. And when you hit share, it should give you a choice of windows to share. And one of them will be carousel. So if you click on that, that's the one, yes.
The family carousel there. Okay.
Yes, we can see that, yeah.
And how do I move you out of the way for the moment here? Oh, you can see that. So if you're looking for a person, say, you've heard of Dolly the sheep? Yes? Right, but I've done D-O-L-Y. Dolly the sheep. Dolly the sheep comes up, and I don't know the person's name, but you say, what's Dolly the sheep got to do with anything? And it says C. Alan Coleman. Well, then I go into Coleman, and we look for an Alan, what is Alan Stewart? Find records. I'll have to minimize yourself down here. Right. Oh, it doesn't say there. Maybe it's a different Alan Coleman. Alan. Well, that's not coming up too well. I'll go into that. That's not a very good start. So I shall look for a Rashida Quincy Delight Jones. Jones, yeah.
Why did you try me? Okay.
So we have Quincy Delight Jones. Can you see the screen I'm looking at? There's no, and then we have,
yeah.
I wasn't sure if you can hear me. So we have Quincy Delight Jones, as you know, the musician, and she married Peggy Lipton. Oh, this is terrible. Peggy Lipton was born in New York, but her mother was Hetty Lipton Rosenberg, and she was born in Dublin in 1912. And this is part of the information we have on her there. And then her mother was Jenny Benson, known as Gittleson. And her father, the great-grandfather, was Benjamin Joseph Benson. And he married, as far as I think it was Julius Benson. Julius Benson, that's his brother, married Fanny Benson, who was a Gravonsky. And one of Fanny Gravonsky's sisters, and there's an interesting story, she's also known as Abramson, which is not the actual name of the family, but they came over in false passports. So some of them were born as known as Abramson, and as you can see, the other members of the family are Gravonsky. And she had a sister called Sarah Gavonsky, who married Avram Hillel Jackson, and they had 10 children. And one of them is Zena, who married Martin Sidney Rosenblatt, and they had a son called Stuart Rosenblatt, which is myself. But an interesting an association to Wales comes on two sides. There's also a sister called Sophie, who married Elisoph, who died in Brighton, but there's also Reverend Snado, the second husband, and he was a reverend in Newport in Wales. And the other sister married a Cron, which is Ivor Cron, and he was born in Wales, in Swansea. At the moment, the original family name is Cronenberg, and I can't find any details on the family or prove the details that I have on the family because I couldn't find Ivor Cron or Cronenberg's marriage birth record. So anybody who has a bit of help there, I'd appreciate it very much. But you can see that we have where they're born, the place where they were born, which is very important. You need a town where they got married, and or the city is very important too. And more important is the cemetery where they're buried. There's no use saying in, let's say in the case came in for Bristol, but which cemetery in Bristol? The 7 cemeteries in Ireland. So they're better off knowing the country where they are. It's not in America or Timbuktu or other places. Then we have occupations. One thing that's never printed is email addresses or phone numbers, but we do have the work address, and there's the inscription of the what's on the tombstone. And we also have Cowan and Levi, and we also use NTS, which means no tombstone. So you're not looking for a tombstone. And another piece of information is if there's no children, that's an important piece of details. So you're not looking for other persons associated with the family. Just as a matter of interest to you, for all the 67 or 68,000 records, I can't find my elusive grandmother, who died giving birth to my father in Żonów in Poland in 1908. So anybody who has access to any of the Żonów records, I'd appreciate very much if they would make contact with me. After all, what do I do with 58,000 other records and I can't find my own grandmother? So I'm still trying. The world loves a trier. So does that answer your question for you?
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Stuart. I think it's. I hope everyone here really appreciates the complexity and detail that's in all of the work that you've been doing, and it's clearly a resource that people will want to use to be creating the kinds of rich stories that Ruth has brought to us today as well. So I'm afraid we are coming up on the end of our time today. So I wanted to thank again both of our speakers. Maybe people could join me with the reaction buttons, or you could clap and you can be seen clapping. It's always nice. I also really want to give you our thanks. They were both excellent talks with lots of really interesting things to follow up in the questions. I draw everyone's attention then, just to remind you, this evening at 6 o'clock, there's Jewish Tales of the Remote Refugee with Dr. Trish Skinner and Tiffany Beebe. And the link for that session is the same as the link for this session. So if you just come back at 6 o'clock and use the same link again, you'll have a chance to join us for that session as well. So thank you very much, everyone, and I hope that you all enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very interesting session.
Very nice. John Burst.